Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Tej. I am a community leader at DataMeet, which is a community of open data enthusiasts. This panel is generally to talk about how do we contribute to civic tech, and I have two of them here whom I know for a long time have been involved with civic tech. I'm going to introduce each one of them. On my right is Rohini. Rohini is director of Bachao project, and also she's a researcher who works with the technology as well as human relationships and gender and various other stuff. I think you can search and get more information about her. On the other side is Kiran. We also know him as Jace, co-founder of HasGeek. You also know HasGeek, I think, and is also co-founder of IFF with other people. So I'm going to start with with couple of questions to both of them before they talk about their individual projects. First thing I wanted to ask them was, how did they actually get into civic tech? Most of us, including me, didn't know how to get into civic tech. I started as like an engineer in a company, and I didn't know how to get into it. So how did you individually on your own get into civic tech? What was your route?
Okay, so there's a story of what I have done, and there's a story of how did I end up doing those things. And there are two different things. So let's start briefly. So among the two things that I've been recently involved in is, one, I was part of the Save the Internet campaign that ran in 2015 and 2016 that asked for net neutrality in India. It started off with being about saying TRAI is not a good regulator to Airtel is trying to do something. Eventually it became a fight against Facebook, and then we won, and we ended up getting actual net neutrality regulations in this country. The other more recent one that I'm involved in is Aadhaar. Obviously, it's now in the Supreme Court, and it's something that I've been helping out with for the last couple of years. Okay, so how I got into these things also requires some level of saying, why do you want to get into these things? When you do any kind of activism, it's a drain on your life. There is absolutely no upside from doing activism. Nobody's paying you for doing this. Nobody's saying, I will give you a raise at your job because you're a nice activist. None of that stuff is going to happen. It's just going to make your life really miserable. And so then the question comes of saying, why are you doing this? And if you feel like you're doing this because it's the right thing, then there's a question of saying, what do you mean by it is the right thing? Where does this sense of morality come from? And to me, one of the things that I read a while ago sort of has stuck in my head for a very long time. I was reading The Economist magazine about a decade ago, and it had an article that talked about stable countries and saying what makes a country stable, in the sense of it being a stable economy in which to build a business in or operate in. And one of the theories has always been natural resources, that if your country has a lot of natural resources, then it's going to be rich. But then the article went into it and said, then why is it that the Middle East, which has oil, which is a super valuable natural resource, not as well regarded as a good society as, say, Northern Europe, where they don't really have any of those things. Or if you look at, say, Norway, which is a country that also has oil and it's also oil-based wealth, how come Norway is a completely different sort of economy from, say, the Middle East? And so the economists had a theory that a good society is built on strong institutions. That you have institutions that perform in very predictable manners, and you can rely on their performance to happen in a specific manner. And thanks to that, you can build your future on the foundation of knowing that things are not unstable, that things are not going to surprise you every turn. And so the theory it held at that point was, if you want a good society, build institutions, and this matters. And so that's something that's been on my head for a very long time. And so when the net neutrality issue came up in 2015, it was not about saying somebody is trying to screw somebody over, or we as consumers are going to be cheated by a company, so let's go protest against it. It was not about that. For me, the interest part was saying there's supposed to be a regulator to prevent such abuse from happening. That regulator as an institution should be functioning. So if they're not functioning, then can we examine it and say, why is it not functioning? Can we go fix that? So you don't worry about net neutrality, you don't worry about Airtel, you don't worry about Facebook. You say businesses will act like businesses, that's fine. If they're supposed to be regulated to set the boundaries of a business, let's go examine why the regulator is not functioning. And so that's really where I got involved from. And to the point of saying that my idea of saying, is this right or is this not right, is that institution functioning or not? If it's not functioning, can we make it function again? Yeah? So we come back to that. So that's really where I came from.
I'd like to emphasize one of the points he made is that if you are getting into civic tech, into activism, it has to be really and truly the way of life for you, and you should know that you won't be happy doing anything else. It doesn't mean that it has to be your day job, but if it can be pretty thankless and it comes with its risks. So I totally emphasize that if you are going to get into it, think long and hard. In terms of the satisfaction, there's nothing like it. How did I get into it? So I was a journalist, technology journalist. I'm an engineer by training, and I was working as a technology journalist for a few years, and the kind of topics that I liked the most and covered the most were on the intersection of human interest and technology, on the intersection of civil liberties, free speech, and so on. And there came a point when I had to opt for a career change, and this seemed like the most obvious thing to do. I have been working as a public policy researcher since, working in different domains of policy, ranging from IPR to gender and sexuality. That's how I got. Was it? It was out of lived experience. What else?
My other question is, when you participate in civic tech or civic discourse, it generally comes with a pushback. I'm paraphrasing Bernard Russell, where he says legal threats are the least ones, and the biggest threat is economic. You lose job, or you get banned, you get censored, and stuff like that. Both of you have businesses or organizations or individual professionals. How do you navigate this, or how do you handle such situations? Who wants to go first?
At a personal level, I feel, like I said, it has to be really and truly the way of life for you to be able to withstand these ups and downs, or like you said, pushback against you at an organizational level, or as a collective, or as an institution. You have to be prepared for these things because you know it's coming, and there are different measures and strategies that you can use to, depending on what you are doing. You cannot come to it from a very collegiate attitude or a position of naivety, saying, oh, let's do this, and let's all be rebels. It does not work like that if you are running well thought out campaign or an organization. And yeah, in the non-for-profit sector, salaries are anyway very low.
I've seen institutions, block funding, block foreign funding, and private sector not getting funds or not getting invested, or you get banned, you don't get a job, or you don't get recommendations and stuff. Do you have any personal experiences, which I'll go to him because you already got a chance. You have any personal experiences which you want to narrate and expand upon, and any tactics to handle that?
Before we get to the personal experience, I think let's talk about the threat. Saying that as an activist, you'll always face a threat, and the question then is, what do you do about a threat? And I'm going to say that threat response really is not the first place to start thinking about this. From a personal basis, you start with thinking about your privilege and saying, how privileged are you? Can you be honest about that and say, do you know your own privilege level? And privilege is something we think of as a dirty word, but there's also the other side to it. Saying that your standing in life really comes out of whatever privileges you had as you were when you were a younger person, and you're completely dependent on your parents. So if your parents could afford to send you to an English medium school, then you obviously learnt English fairly early in life and became conversant with the language. If your parents could not send you to an English medium school, you learnt it little later in life because it was necessary for work, and then your comfort is not going to be at the same level as someone who learned it younger. So, if you know the extent of your privilege, you also know the extent to which a threat does not threaten you. Yeah? Let's take a simple example. You had an accident. Okay? Somehow your car skidded off the road and you crashed into a tree or whatever else. Now that's going to cost you something to repair. Plus it's probably going to involve a police case or whatever else. Okay. How do you react to this? Has anyone crashed a bike as a child when you're underage? Okay. You crashed a bike as a child, right? So what happens when you crash a bike as a child? It freaks the fuck out of you, right? You don't want to let anybody know. You don't want your parents to know. You don't want society to know. It's a serious embarrassment to you because it feels like you've destroyed your life by crashing a bike. And this is the end of it. There's nothing further to look forward to. If you were to do this in your late 30s or 40s, so you just pick up and move on, man. What's there? After a point, you realize that society doesn't care to the extent where the police are surprised if you try to file a report. And they'll try their level best to get you to go away and say that, please, we do not want the problem. We don't care if you had an accident or not. Just go away. So this is something that changes with life as your sense of social comfort increases, that you're a little more set in life and a threat is not really a threat. It doesn't even appear on your threat radar. So the first part is knowing this. People are going to threaten you all the time. Does that threat even scare you? Yeah? And it comes to this, saying, can you be intimidated? That's really where it starts from. And so the first thing you need to know as an activist is, at what point of intimidation can you not afford to take it anymore? It's too risky. And does the other party know this? Because chances are that they don't actually know. Because most of society is very easy to scare. And so it's easy to simply give you a threatening phone call saying somebody will do something, and most people will just stop doing it. So part of what I've gone through is also realizing that when someone makes you a threat, they also risk exposure because now the threat is explicit. So you can always report it and say, look, that person has been threatening me. Yeah? And then they have a problem because that's a PR problem for them, that their name got associated with the threat. So what you'll find is people who are trying to threaten you will try to threaten you in a manner in which they don't expose themselves, which means the threat cannot be severe. Okay, as a simple example, last year I had a fairly bizarre incident on Twitter where a bunch of people started tagging me and a few others on tweets saying we are anti-national, we are preventing progress in this country by opposing Aadhaar, and we could have been doing so much more for society, carrying on from previous work on net neutrality to also then make a strong technology base for this country. But instead we are hijacking the movement and talking about Aadhaar and whatnot. And this just got increasingly bizarre over a few days. And at one point we had to say, who are these idiots? Do they think they're threatening us on Twitter by tagging us in tweets? Because trolling on Twitter is something that is a well-known phenomenon, right? You may or not have experienced it firsthand. But if you've read enough reports about how trolling on Twitter works, you know the mechanism. You know what's going on. You know that it is just some people trying to scare you. Now, can you actually be scared by doing this? It depends on your standing in life. If you're in a place where you have to be afraid of, say, your landlord living downstairs who will read one of these reports and say, I don't want this problem person in my house, so please vacate my premises, go live somewhere else. No, that's a threat. Okay. So what you don't want is a nosy landlord discovering that you're not a welcome tenant. Okay. If you don't have a nosy landlord problem, then what's the problem? They're not going to be able to scare you by saying we'll get you evicted, right? So what happens then is knowing that thing, So I was seeing the trolling happening on Twitter and I was like, I can think of this as an academic exercise. I don't have to take this personally. Somebody somewhere is writing these messages. Let me go figure out who it is. So I went and figured it out. It was ridiculously easy because it turns out most people do not know the ABC of information security. If you go try to reset a password on Twitter, it'll tell you the email address it sent a reset link to. It doesn't tell you the full email address, but that's fine because it gives you part of the email address. It gives you mask out. So you know your suspects, go match their email addresses. Twitter is so stupid that the number of stars it puts in the masked email address matches the actual number of letters in the email address. So it's ridiculously easy to go compare that against your own address book and figure out who it was. Okay? And that's what I did. It turned out that it was a person named Sharad Sharma who runs an organization called the Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable, which is a pro-Aadhaar outfit. And it was the head of the organization doing this. And it was fairly bizarre to be saying, why is the head of the organization doing this instead of hiring a chamsa to do it? Why would you risk being caught? and bringing down your entire organization. And the reason it turns out is the head of the organization was actually operating alone. The organization was not with him. Okay? So what ended up happening is that he lost the organization anyway because he did not have their buy-in into doing something like this. And so what happened there? There was someone threatening me on Twitter, trying to intimidate me into silence. All I had to do was go figure out who it was and publish the name. And obviously when you do this, a lot of people don't take it seriously. So I also published his name and published all the tweets he had posted under the fake handle. And said, look at what this man said under his fake handle. Okay? And then everybody who else was tagged into this got involved and said, okay, let's join in the melee and point out the fact that somebody was doing this. And so it ended up being a national news story. The fact that somebody was tagging me on some random tweets. It didn't have to be, because the expectation of the intimidator was that I would see a tweet and get scared. What ended up happening is their organization got destroyed because their privilege level extended to the fact that their own community would not tolerate such behavior, and so they had to hide it. The moment it was exposed, that was the end of it for them. Okay? We're seeing more of this building up, and honestly, a lot of times it's just about this. Don't be intimidated because it is not that serious.
This intervention, yeah, it's quite interesting because what Jace just said is a kind of threat assessment and threat modeling in your real life, the way you would do it as a cybersecurity professional or enthusiast in your work life or in your hobbies. What is it that does not impact, or what is not a credible threat is a valid and interesting way of looking at it. It may not work out to be the same for women, like he said, what's your privilege? So queer groups or women, it's very different because it's not just the credibility of the threat, but the way the police or society or even your own family would react to that kind of a situation. So the most common scenario to a woman being abused on Twitter, like receiving abusive tweets on Twitter, is get off Twitter. So then it becomes a matter of their free speech being curtailed versus how do they survive this abuse and still continue to do the work that they are doing. So, yes, it is very much a matter of privilege.
Let's go from sad to some action. There's so many people here probably want to get into some kind of work which helps civic society, and most of them are security professionals. Do you have an idea or a path or a way or call for action for them to get involved? You can start with talking about your project. For example, Kiran worked with Save the Internet, which actually involved with net neutrality saving, and then now I also Kharna, which publishes stories on Aadhaar and other related things. You can probably talk about that and indicate about how you can ask people to participate in your thing, or how they can participate in any other thing. Yeah, you're right. And then we'll come to you.
Okay. So on Aadhaar, this is something that I started becoming reasonably active on in 2016, and now it's fairly deeply involved. So if you guys remember the Supreme Court hearings on the right to privacy that happened last year, do you guys remember the opening statement that Shyam Devan made when he talked about why biometrics are problematic? So his assertion at that point in the court was that my biometrics are part of my body. So if the state makes a copy of my biometrics, it is violating my bodily integrity. Okay. Now this was a statement that the lawyer made, and to me and other techies sitting in Bangalore and discussing this, it felt slightly off. That this was not the way we thought about biometrics. After all, it's a copy. It's not like your body was taken away, right? It's like saying that taking a picture of me violates my bodily integrity. That's not a statement that's going to fly anywhere. So why should it fly with biometrics? After all, it is just a picture of your finger. So this was something that bothered me, saying that I don't know who this argument is going to work for, who is it convincing to, but it is not convincing to me as a techie. And I would not accept this line of argument against biometrics. Obviously, there are problems with biometrics, but this is not the problem that I would highlight. So, and the question is, what do you do about it? I mean, I'm sitting in Bangalore writing computer code, and I'm reading tweets about a lawyer in the Supreme Court saying something and saying, I don't agree. But I'm not the lawyer in the Supreme Court. I'm not the judge. So who the heck am I to not agree? Why does it matter? And so going from this point of being someone with an opinion and absolutely no influence to saying we have to do something became a multi-step journey. And it was not a multi-step journey saying this is my plan to get to point X. It was more about saying I want to do a few things and maybe they'll help. And it turns out they did help. So what happened was about 6 months ago, after a little time after the right to privacy judgment, Anand Venkatnarayanan, who's a techie in Bangalore who works at NetApp, and I were talking about Aadhaar and saying, we have written some things about Aadhaar and published it on Medium. Now, Medium is a great place to publish if you want to write. It is not a great place to publish if you want somebody to read it. Okay? Because nobody reads anything on Medium. And nobody takes Medium seriously because, after all, Medium is a self-publishing platform. And we had written on Medium because of the frustration of working with media agencies, because media agencies typically don't understand technical content. So if I want to tear down the architecture of some system and say there is a flaw in this architecture which will cause problems 1 year later when somebody discovers how to exploit the flaw, and you go to Times of India and publish it, they'll say, what is this thing? They have no idea how to discuss the material you're giving to them. So we had been frustrated by not getting through to media editors, and we just taken to saying, screw it, we're going to write it on Medium, publish it ourselves. Now we had gone from doing that to saying, how do we go from here to doing something more useful? So we thought, let's do a simple experiment. Let's just create a Medium publication for our articles and put them all under the same publication so that at least there is one index page that has all our content. Because otherwise it's distributed across individual Medium accounts. So we did that. We called it Karana. That's a Kannada word for reason. And it's medium.com/Karana. And in the spirit of Aadhaar misspellings, we also have a single A in our name. So even though it is a Karana, it is Karana and not Kaa. Because with Aadhaar, even though it's double A, everybody puts it with a single A. So we figured, okay, let's make the same mistake ourselves. So you'll find it at medium.com/Karana. We started writing, and within a few months, we had so much content in there that any time we ended up having an argument with somebody who said, no, Aadhaar is secure, we say, okay, here it is, read the documentation. We took their own official documentation, pointed out all the loopholes in it, and it's on one place, so you can read all the articles in one place instead of searching for it on the internet. So we did that, and by December, this project had built up to the point where I figured, why don't we just go to Delhi and meet the lawyers? And so we ended up doing that. So Anand spent his Christmas vacation in Delhi because that was the time he got off from work. So he went there, went to Shyam Devan's office and said, look, I've written all these things. And Shyam Devan said, what is all this? And he ended up spending an entire week over there explaining everything, saying, here are the details that you missed in your court arguments that matter. Okay. Then January 1st week, I went to Delhi, did the same thing. So I picked up from where Anand had left off. Discovered contacts in the security industry who had previously worked in the government, who knew something about the insider stuff, set up meetings between the lawyers and various people who knew something about the tech side. And the lawyers obviously are not from technical background, so they don't even know who to ask when you need some clarification on what's going on. So we basically, what we did was give them a Rolodex saying, here are all the techies you can call if you need to understand a technical argument. So just because the government said, no, technology is secure, and the judge says, but data is encrypted, is bullshit. That statement means absolutely nothing because it lacks context. And so call us, we'll give you the context to evaluate whether a statement has any meaning or not. So we ended up doing that. And finally, when the court opened for the Aadhaar hearings in January, Shyam Devan makes an opening remark again. Remember, previous time remark was, when you take my biometrics, my bodily integrity is violated. This time's opening remark was, I have rights under the Constitution. The right is well defined. I have a right. There is no ambiguity whether I have the right today or not. When you do a probabilistic match with my fingerprints, it may or may not match, depending on the system's mood that day. That my finger was not placed correctly, the algorithm was not correct, the network was not correct, all kinds of things may not be correct, and my fingerprint may not match. It's a probabilistic match. how can my right under the constitution be probabilistic? That was the argument he made in court. Okay? He took the technology, tore it down entirely, reframed it under the rights that the constitution provides, and questioned it and said, who is guaranteeing that this software upholds my rights? It's a probabilistic technology. You can't say that the computer decided whether I'm who I am or not. Okay? And that set the tone for the argument. And you look at the arguments made in court in this session compared to last year's, it's entirely technical. Every single detail has been broken down to the technology and said this technology versus that part of the law, they don't match. Therefore, the technology is violating the law. Okay? And this has now put the government on the back foot, because if you look at what the government's defenses so far have been, it's just completely bullshit. There is absolutely no defense that they've been able to put forward. And every single time they try to introduce some new way of saying, but this about Aadhaar, but that about Aadhaar, we're ready to give them more material and say, no, we have investigated the technology. There is none of these things are real. Yeah, that there is a lot of bluster coming out of the government that has no basis whatsoever, that can be broken down easily. If you look at the editorial that Shrikant Nadamani published in the Times of India this morning, is once again saying Aadhaar cannot possibly enable surveillance. And you say, really? I mean, again, they're making the same statement. Who are they expecting? They're fooling. I mean, it's fine to write in Times of India editorial and convince the masses that Aadhaar is secure. But the place you need to do this convincing is in court. And there you do not have the right people. Yeah? Because we have armed the lawyers with the technology that they need to know how to present the case properly. And so this is essentially an accident that came out of saying, instead of just sitting back and complaining or tweeting about my problems with whatever life is like around me, let me go to where the influence exists and convince them to listen to me. Okay? And we are now pretty much working with all the lawyers. We're working with Shyam Devan, we're working with Gopal Subramaniam, we're working with Arvind Datar, we're working with Kapil Sibal. All of them are getting the material from us, from a blog that we wrote on Medium. Okay? All we had to do was go tell them and say, look, the material is there, we are available, ask us questions. Okay? So that's something that all of us should be doing. That if you need to act, just step up and do something. If you need guidance on where to go do something, come and talk to me.
And Rohini works with lots of apps with respect to women's safety and stuff. And the only app I've used with respect to that is one called Safety Pin long time back. My only interaction was I'd found an open directory with code listing and then had to send them an email, tell them, can you just not expose this code to the people. That was my only introduction to, apps. Do you want to talk about them, and what can this community do for that kind of apps and that kind of sector?
So apps, smartphone apps particularly, and in general, in technological interventions for public safety or citizen safety, something I've been studying for the past 6 odd years. Chinmay over here, who's the curator of this track, and I released a report last year with a study of about 30-35 different apps that were operational in India. And some of these are targeted just at women. If you see the way they work, anybody could use it, but very often they are called women safety apps. And if you would notice that if a major newsy incident happens, like the gang rape in Delhi in 2012 on board the bus, there is a sudden avalanche of these tech interventions. So and the makers would say, oh, but this has happened and I am now motivated to help solve this problem, and this is my contribution. Regardless of how well intentioned this tech intervention could be, if it does not include other aspects which are necessary to make the technology holistic, like do you include the people you're trying to target? Have you done a test? Have you just shown your app to a woman and said, would you use this? These are things that are often ignored, and just like Tej just gave an example that there was code that was exposing people's locations. So it means that this is a problem that's rooted in society, in culture and politics, and it cannot be solved at the level of technology and treating technology as lionizing the cause of public safety, citizen safety, women's safety, whatever. You need to work with the demographics who you are trying to help or trying to work with. This also, and in terms of the call to action, this also means you need a little experience of working with communities. And I was this engineer in college who I walked into the office of an environmental NGO and said, listen, this is what I can do, this is what I bring to the table, how can I volunteer with you? And it was a very different world altogether, because I had absolutely no clue about how to work with communities, and all my knowledge of human problems was entirely theoretical from in all the reading I had done. So we have this report is online. And let's say, specifically with respect to women's safety apps, some of them are asking for your device ID, for the contacts book when it's not necessary. They're asking for a lot of unnecessary and overarching permissions, which means that, like with all other security and privacy interventions, and I keep saying security and privacy because, I always say, to me, they are like yin and yang. One can't exist without the other. It means, let's take a scenario where a woman has an abusive partner, and this kind of an app will actually encourage and enable more such abuse. Or if there are apps run by the police department and they don't actually run it, they outsource it to some developer within the city, there's a public notification that mobile phones in the country should come equipped with a physical panic button, which is not an app. But the latest news is that there have been trial runs, and every person, it's not just women, every person in the country should have their phones enabled with this panic button, which contacts the police directly. This means that if you have an app or any kind of security emergency response system or emergency alert system, which tracks your location, which has access to your contact book, which has access to your device ID, to your IMEI, you're just open to surveillance, and you may not even know it. Or surveillance, if not by the police, then the third-party developer. So these, how much time do I have? Okay, yeah. So when you develop apps, very often you need to know the specific needs of the group, which is contextualizing the technology that you're trying to build or improve. And a good way to work with it would be to go through multiple iterations by asking the end user, your target user, who's not necessarily a technical person, use it and tell me what it is. And there's a deluge of these apps in India. If some of them, there's one run by entertainment channel, there are about 20-25 run by police departments in different cities. They give false alarms to your friends. So you have a predefined, more or less this is the way it was, you have a predefined list of contacts to which it sends a distress message. Sometimes it picks up a location. If the app supports taking and transmitting the location, which is usually a Google Maps link. Sometimes it captures a video. There's one app which actually captures a 5-second video and sends it off. Some of them capture an audio. And there's the opportunity or the likelihood of this being misused is a lot, especially if it's being run in tandem with the police department and so on. On the other hand, if the app does not convey this to the police, but only conveys this to your social circles, it means that the onus of your safety is now on people in your social circles and on yourself. And if the app fails or something else happens, it means you will end up you as the victim will end up being blamed. Yes. So I would suggest before you even start working on an intervention, regardless of how motivated you are to solve a certain human problem, it is necessary to either gain all that knowledge first. JSS is a wonderful example where the skills and knowledge of one set of professionals was clubbed with the skills and knowledge of another set of professionals to solve a huge problem. So even before you start working on an intervention where you are not necessarily the group that's impacted or directly affected, I would suggest first get your context right from the group that you, for whom you're trying to address the problem. You may or may not find technical people. It's very good to have people who have knowledge of both working with vulnerable groups, communities, and people who also know the tech. But if that is not so I'm just giving overarching thoughts. If you would like to know specifics, you could also talk to me later or to Chinmay, who's my colleague. Yeah.
We have another 8 minutes, so if you have any questions, we can take up some questions both to Kiran or to me. Go ahead. I'll bring the mic to you.
So I know most of the work you do, and I believe the real issues in civic tech in India. But frankly, I don't understand, or my understanding of the civic tech not becoming mainstream in India is lack of funding and the government's push. So there are ads everywhere every day that this minister has launched an app for that, or each government saying that we are innovating in government. But frankly, you know that as a techie, you know that there's something really wrong with what they're doing and what they're announcing. And you see that these very apps being implemented across the country in different variations, none of them work. Everything is a pilot. So my understanding is it happens because there's no standards. And we haven't learned anything from US, from their civic tech movements, which also in certain ways has its own issues. So how do we push it in governance? As a community, we can build certain things, we can adopt it in movements, we can adopt it to improve our society in general, but how do we make it large? How do we actually bring it to a common man?
Who wants to take it?
Yeah. So this is a difficult problem to solve. Okay, and I think we need to recognize the extent of the difficulty. So one of the things I'm going to go off slightly on a tangent. Okay, one of the things I learned a few years ago about the ISKCON society is they hold property around the world. Okay? And if you become a member of ISKCON, you're eligible to stay in any of the ISKCON properties worldwide for up to 3 days or so. Okay? So there are people who become members of ISKCON because it's basically a really cheap hotel. Okay? You go anywhere in the world, your first 3 days you pay dirt cheap rates because you go stay in the ISKCON temple. Okay? And if you're a backpacker, it's wonderful. And at one point I was saying, I don't actually believe in God, but I don't mind an ISKCON membership if this is what it comes to. If this is how it's going to improve my life. And so when you think about this, for me as an individual, I thought I was discovering a hack and saying that, hey, this society gives me something I really want. I'm going to live with the other nonsense that they want to put on my head, because as long as I don't admit to the world that I've suddenly turned into a devotee, it's fine. I get my free hotel, and I can stay anywhere in the world. And ultimately I didn't sign up because for me there was a problem with this. If I don't believe in God, I can't do this. I can't hack their system to get a free accommodation. But let's turn it around and say, what is in it for ISKCON to be doing something like this? To give away really cheap accommodation to all their members anywhere in the world. Okay? And if you start examining it from there, you'll discover that they're not the only ones doing this. last night I discovered that there is a society called the Freemasons, which started off like 500 years ago of people who basically built stone houses. They were stonemasons, and there are no masons in that society anymore. But they are like literally a chapter of worldwide places that are now considered as some kind of a secret society, but really they're just about free accommodation for all the members anywhere in the world. And it doesn't end over there. The church does this for their members, which is really where the foundation of this idea comes from. So if you stop and think about it and say, to an institution, what does it mean to be doing these things? The fact that you think of yourself as a real estate operation where you create properties around the world and give your members some sense of safety to be in and whatnot, means for a member, you give them a very clear incentive to sign up and be part of this. But what you've done then is bought their loyalty. And then they're going to be around for you when you need something. And once you start examining this, you'll discover that lots of societies work like this. And one of the most stunning examples is political parties. Ultimately, what is a political party to the average person on the street? What are you going to get out of being a BJP supporter or a Congress supporter? Is it like they're going to come and give you some freebies in your place just because you have proclaimed yourself a BJP or a Congress supporter? If you go down and examine their networks and see what is it that they do to campaign on the ground and convince people to vote for a particular candidate and build up all the way to winning elections at the national level, is they run self-help societies at the street level. There are groups of people in a neighborhood who get together and say that we are united to solve problems for our community. And when you get to a problem that cannot be solved at the local level and requires some cooperation with the neighborhood community or whatnot, then you go to the same association in that area and say, let's resolve problems. And you keep building this up. You get to the point of one day electing the chief, the prime minister of the country. Okay? And the BJP obviously has been super successful at building up this network over the last few years, which is really why they win elections no matter where in the country they go and regardless of what they do with the economy. Okay? So this is a sort of a crucial lesson that if you want to create a successful movement, then you set up structures of incentives for your individual members that do not involve you delivering at the top level, but members helping each other, coming together under a common ideology and basically running their own show. That you're not doing anything for them, they're doing it for themselves. They're just united by your common message. I think Null itself is a great example of doing that. That you've got Null chapters across the country that are not about saying command center from Delhi sends you notices about what your Null chapter is doing every month. That's not how it works. All your chapters are independent. They work independently for your own local benefit, and eventually you come together once a year for something like NullCon. But you also come together when something crucial needs to happen somewhere else, where you need to intervene. And so, part of the important lesson I've learned is that it's one thing to be an activist sitting in one place, writing your blog on the internet and hoping that you will get something done. It's something else to say, can I take my influence up a notch by actually going talking to the right people, being part of the case in the Supreme Court or whatnot. But the really deep engagement is when you can create an actual grassroots movement on the ground of individual groups helping each other, but that unite under a common banner when the banner is required. And I think we need to think about it and say that this is how you build an institution, that you think about the incentives for an individual member that have nothing to do with your larger agenda, but that creates their loyalty that helps you with your larger agenda.
Yes, the activist hive mind, so to speak. I would agree with Jace, and its lack of funding, as Srinivas said, is a major reason. But it's not just the economics of it all. It also boils down to awareness and so on. I'm going to do my public policy pitch over here and say, please be a lot more involved in governance. Your responsibility doesn't end with voting, and there are people who also don't vote at all. But you need to stay involved. Let's say there are calls for comments to a lot of papers or consultations that the TRAI does or other standards body do. When you brought up standards, technical standards for a lot of things are missing in India, and enforcement is even more difficult. Implementation of the standards is a lot more difficult, and some things just come in from the grey supply chain. So, there it's a complete washout of the adherence to standards. But even in the US, safety interventions, and since I've spoken about safety interventions, I'm taking off from there, like stun guns, which deliver a high voltage electric shock to when operated, they do not have a technical standard. And if you see the specifications written on them, they are often like you just cannot believe that it has this much, it's going to deliver this much voltage, this much current. And there's a lot of misinformation because it says it will deliver a shock of it's the voltage that determines the shock and not the current. And then you start to wonder, well, one cannot exist without the other if it's going to electrocute someone. So yes, lack of technical standards, lack of guidelines for software developers, or even in terms of hardware on how do you develop without disrupting something else that's already in the system as a community, or even as technical guidelines. And just stand up and be counted. The panic button thing that I mentioned, which was introduced by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, this was the first declaration was made sometime in 2013 or 14, but it is pretty scary because it is for every single mobile phone in the country, and they are trying to convince manufacturers to introduce this button in new handsets and modify existing handsets. You will need a GPS module. It is going to drive up prices of mobile handsets, and it's for everyone and not just women. And the distress call is going to go to the police directly. So these are things that directly impact the general citizen. And I would then say the best way to get involved is to stand up and make your government, make your local MP, councillor, minister, whatever, accountable, and say, hey, this is not what I want. And that's how democracy functions, right? At every step, you make the people you elect accountable.
My own experience with DataMate has been, working with the mid-level bureaucrats is you have a much better success rate working with mid-level bureaucrats because they are there for like 58 years. Unlike politicians who are there for 5 years. So you make friends with bureaucrats and make them part of your community. I mean, if you see DataMate community, like most of them who ask help or provide help are government officials, which, probably if you go to their office, they may not do, but they are doing it on the email list because they feel they're part of a community. And every time we get a call from one of them, it's like out of their personal interest, somebody is calling, oh, should I, we are releasing maps, should I release it in a KML or GeoJSON? It's that kind of question they ask. I mean, they're open to asking questions. So I would say, like, building contacts or community around mid-level government officials is probably a smart thing to do as well. Any other questions? We can take one more question.
So you mentioned a lot of problems today. So I was just going to ask that Justice B.N. Krishna has published a white paper on data protection framework, right? So does it solve most of these problems that you mentioning today, or like there's still a lot of shortcomings, or like how efficient will that be? Because there's nothing as far as I know, like there's just an IT Act which doesn't like take care of privacy at all. Nothing.
Well, actually, yes, it's probably going to be a month. So let's start with, so there is the formal definition of what this committee is supposed to do, and there is the actual operation that's going on. The formal definition is that the committee puts out a white paper that says, we want to introduce data protection. People give them suggestions. They say, okay, let's take all the good suggestions, makes a paper, makes it law. Okay, formally, this is what's supposed to happen. Now, the reality is what has actually happened. First of all, let's look at how the committee was formed. How long did it take to select the people on the committee? Any guesses? No. 1 day. Half a day, in fact. So when the right to privacy hearing was happening in August last year, one day the government comes to the court and says, you do not have a fundamental right to privacy, but that's okay because we intend to introduce one. And the court is not impressed. Next day they come back and say, oh, by the way, here's a committee, here are all the members. Okay, and the members discovered that they were members because they heard a name in court. They didn't know that they were on the committee. Okay? And so it was literally about saying, find 10 people, put them on the damn committee, and people who can't walk out of it. And so it turns out that there is this guy named Argo Sengupta on the committee, who the previous day was in court saying you do not have a right to privacy. Okay? And he's in the committee and saying, what is he doing there? Who the heck decided that this person is appropriate included in the committee? He must have done it himself, He must have argued in court, realized that this is not going to work, so he appointed himself a boss and some friends and said, okay, now there's a committee, the government is serious. So it starts there. The committee spent several months refusing to answer how it was going to do its consultation and how it was going to arrive at a decision. There is no civil society representative on the committee. If you look at the committee, it's entirely government and industry representation. There is no civil society representation representing the rights of individuals. So that's a very curious omission. There was no official commitment to saying, let's ask the public. So we had to lobby them for it and saying, what are you guys up to? Who are you people? How did you get appointed? What do you intend to do? And then they said, okay, let's talk to the public. Let's do an open house in January. And when you go to an open house, you're expected to hear what other people are saying and respond to them saying, I disagree with that person. But nobody knows what anybody else is saying because nobody's been asked to write a response. Because the deadline for writing a response to the white paper was January 31st. The session they conducted was January 6th? 5th. In Delhi was 5th. And you look at this and say, you're supposed to come on 5th and respond to a comment that will be submitted on 31st. Are you supposed to mind read everybody in this room and say, I know that person is going to say something, so I will tell you right now I disagree with him. What are you supposed to do in this meeting, So you have to ask the justice and say, what are you doing? Why are you asking for responses to other people before they've said anything? This is not how you run a process. First, let them write something, put it online, give us a month to read it, then you come back and say, do you disagree with that person? Let's talk. Okay. So their entire process was inverted, and obviously it asked them and say, and what have you been doing for the last few months? You were constituted in August, and as of January, nobody knows what you're trying to do. And fortunately, the justice himself has a conscience, and he responds to criticism of this sort, saying that you are subverting the due process. So, as of February, he's revealed the minutes of the meetings that have happened so far. And as it turns out, the very first meeting said, the government came and said, here is a draft. Okay? All you have to do is make it a law. Your job is done. And the justice apparently blew his top and said, what are you doing here? You have hired me to decide on the law. And on my first day on the job, you say, here is the law. Am I supposed to be the rubber stamp here? Okay? Now that is what is actually going on. Now, it's essentially at this point, the justice versus his committee, not the justice and his committee. At this point, we're just trying to see what can be done.
Anything to add to the process?
No, it's not that I don't want to say, it's just that I may not stop speaking. And we're almost out of time because it's such a complex issue with so many different aspects and nuances. But yes, adding to what he had said, the process is comments and counter comments, and the discussions that they did in various cities were timed in a way that, they could have been, after knowing the different positions, different peoples in the government, the industry, the civil society, or even individual citizens had. So that there is usually a process to how these mechanisms or these steps in the formation of a new legislation happen. In this case, it was not done, and I wish a lot more people stood up and said, "Hey, this is not acceptable." Even the committee that was formed in this.
I think this whole thing was as a response to how the Aadhaar law came into picture. I mean, if you know how the Aadhaar, it got written overnight and got passed overnight and got criticized for that for a lot. So they wanted to show that, we are listening to you. I think this is just a show, according to me personally, This is just a show to show that we are listening to you. I think that law is already written. Probably it will get passed overnight. Yeah. True. Anyway, with that sad comments and sad situation, we'll close the day. You can catch both of them outside and any of other people. Thank you so much for being kind, audience. Thank you.